Okay, got it. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Schwartz, and who is living in a laboratory near Donner Pass in the Sierra Mountains at Soda Springs, which is about 10 miles from Truckee, for the last year with his wife and 2 dogs, measuring snow and other things, and doing other kinds of research regarding the snow. So, and there is a very interesting article after we had obtained him that he wrote an editorial for the New York Times. I think there's a link to it in our webpage. If not, we'll get it up there. And which explains a lot that he is doing up there, because there are over 265 states throughout the state of California where they're looking at different snow levels, I believe. And but he's at one of the very few where somebody is actually living on site all the time and working about this, the snowpack. And it's very related to water, since when the snow melts, it makes water, but it's much more complicated than that, which is why we have invited him here tonight, and he will explain it all to us. So, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Carol. I appreciate the introduction. And yeah, I actually wrote this presentation a little bit before that article came out, but I'll make points throughout it. Throughout the presentation tonight about little things that I spoke about in there. If the internet starts being weird, let me know. It gets a little fussy from time to time because we don't have real internet up here. It's basically a cell tower modem that we have to use. So if it gets a little angry, let me know, and generally we can wait it out.
It looks like the Campanile will look for the falcons there too.
That it is. Yeah, there are falcons up there right now. I don't think it's a little bit less snowy than it actually is outside here, but right. Yeah, I like that one. It makes me feel like I'm down in the Bay Area, relaxed. So I guess with that, I'll get started. So as Carol said, let me get rid of this too, so that you guys don't have to stare at yourselves. So as Carol mentioned, I am the station manager and lead scientist of the Central Sierra Snow Lab up here. And I've been here for just about a year now, just a couple days less actually. And it's been quite an exciting first year for sure, but a very good one, to be honest. So I'm kind of talking about a hodgepodge of all things snow science in the lab and myself today. Just an overall introduction to everything that's kind of going on up here, how I wound up here, what we're focusing on, ways you can kind of keep an eye on the ways that you can kind of keep an eye on the site itself through our website and social media. And then actually, I was going to take you outside to do a little kind of mock tour with my phone, but with the snowfall, and the fact that it's dark outside, it's probably not going to work out too well. So unfortunately, we might have to pass on that one today, but that's not too big of a deal. So what is the Central Sierra Snow Lab? I'm sure that you've at least heard of us, hopefully. It was a little bit of a hole in the wall that not a lot of people knew about up until about a year ago. So I've really been trying hard to get us back out in the public eye. And CSSL, as we call it in short, is just simply a field research station of UC Berkeley. And we do all things snow physics, hydrology, meteorology, climatology, and we do a lot with instrument design too. So we implement a lot of new technologies and tested a lot of new technologies. It's one of the cool things about this lab. But kind of an overview, it is really just a cabin in the woods, as you can see on the top left there. You know, it's just this little 3-bedroom cabin effectively that has had its living room replaced with office space. So we have 3 bedrooms upstairs. We have a basement workroom, which includes little benches for doing electrical work and instrumentation work. We do have a kitchen, and then of course a bathroom as well. And a recent addition as of the last few years before I was here was a wet chemistry lab. So we actually can do some good chemistry on site as well. We do have what we call the snowcat garage, which is a big garage that the old snowcats used to be stored in, and that has full working metal shops and wood shops. And so between the lab building itself and the garage, we can kind of wait out whatever hits us, including almost 18 feet of snow that we got in December in 2.5 weeks. But of course, the crown jewel on the site here is the snow study site, which is on the right-hand side. And that has just all kinds of different instrumentation on it. This photo was actually taken a while back, and I'm implementing some new things on the site here that aren't in this picture, but I guess you might just have to wait until summertime once those are finished to keep an eye on things and see what those look like. But I'll go into that a little bit later. So as a bit of history, and I promise I won't go through too much of it, but in 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Weather Bureau, which is now the National Weather Service, formed the Cooperative Snow Investigations Research Program. And that was because they realized they didn't have a good understanding of hydrological processes in the West. And so they really wanted to get this project going that could start to really identify how these processes worked and how they affect us, of course. And so in 1946, the lab was built as one of 3 outdoor laboratories. The 2 others were in Oregon and Oregon and Montana, and they have since then closed. And so we are the last one standing. And on the right top side there, you can see the lab back in 1947 with various bits of instrumentation. And oddly enough, that photograph is not far off what it looks like today. Not lucky enough to have snowfall this morning. In 1954, the Army Corps and then the Weather Bureau kind of disbanded things and decided that they were done with the site. And then the Forest Service picked it up, and they worked together with the California Department of Water Resources to kind of keep things running, funding the site, doing various bits of science, all kinds of good things like that. And the funny thing about looking through all this history in these old records is if you look at that photo on the bottom right, it looks incredibly similar to what the Department of Water Resources does for their measurements today. If you've seen any of their press releases, that is exactly the same process that we use every month to get samples of our snowpack. And it's still going on some odd 70 years later. We haven't changed that much, 75 years later, I should say. So kind of funny to look through these old photos and realize, we're still doing things the exact same way. In 1996, the Forest Service decided they no longer wanted to manage the site. And that's when Berkeley's Vice Chancellor of Research decided to take over operations. And that's when my predecessor kind of stepped up, and Randall Osterhuber, who was here until 2019, really worked to continue facilitating the research here at the lab. And as part of that, actually managed something called the Onion Creek Experimental Forest, which is about 8 miles southwest of us. And so I continue managing that site too. So in 2019 and 2020, Randall retired. And then of course, he retired in November 2019. The university didn't know if they wanted to continue the lab. And so they were considering completely zeroing out the budget. And of course, they had this wonderful town hall in January 2020 with a lot of collaborators saying, no, you have to keep it going. And the university decided to keep it alive. And then COVID hit, which meant a hiring freeze for UC Berkeley. So in that time, there was an interim manager that came up to do the measurement so that the long records that had been developed here weren't lost. And luckily, he did a great job of that. And then I took over last year in April, on April 15th. So I mentioned that long history of records. On the top right there, you can see what is the maximum snow depth every year, which is the blue, and then the total snowfall, which is the gray, from 1879 through 2021. And the reason why we have that through going all the way back to 1879 is because the railroad that came over the pass here on Donner Summit actually started doing those measurements on their own. So we obtained those from them, and then actually we're fairly close to where they were doing those measurements. So we've got basically 150 years of snowfall records, and it's one of the longest, if not the longest record in the world. So very, very cool. And then that bottom image is actually just an image of the Onion Creek experimental site that I actually hiked down into just a couple weeks ago to get some measurements. And that brings us up to current. So here's me. I am kind of a lover of all things weather. You can see me on the left there, kind of, in my element in the snow. But I also absolutely love storm chasing. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and so we had plenty of severe weather. And I love to go out and chase tornadoes. That one on the top right is one that I caught my last chase before I did my PhD abroad. That was magnificent. That image underneath it with the car was actually us doing some hail research during my PhD. And then on the bottom right, before I did my PhD, I was working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And that was our test site, which was much larger than the lab here, but had a lot of similar instrumentation. And I was kind of hamming it up with a bit of grass in my mouth in that image. But that's kind of me, all things weather, kind of goofy, and all over the place when it comes to what I really like doing. So after leaving NCAR, I went to do my PhD, and it was in an area probably most of you really associate with a lot of snow, right? It was Australia, so maybe not so much. So yes, I actually visited Uluru, which is the wonderful, gorgeous rock / boulder out in the middle of the outback in that center picture. But yeah, I did my PhD on snow in the snowy mountains down in Australia that contributes up to 66% of their agricultural water. So very little sliver of mountain with snow on it, but outrageously important. And I think, us as Californians can definitely identify with that now. So I went down there and did my PhD on how bushfires, what we called wildfires, are impacting the snow. So how does the snow differ, in a burned forest versus a regular forest versus even just out in the open? And these are 3 sites that I deployed as part of my field work during that. On the left was kind of our control site where it wasn't in a forest. And on each of these sites were different instrumentation. So the ones that kind of look like stacked plates are temperature and relative humidity probes. And the reason why they looked like stacked plates is because those are to let air flow through them, but protect them from sunlight. So the sun isn't changing the actual measurement of the temperature. The kind of awkward claw looking thing, it has almost like spider legs facing each other on the top and bottom. That measured what we call flux of water vapor and heat. So it actually measured how much water vapor and heat was being contributed to the snow versus leaving the snow. So that helped us understand how that affected our melt overall. On the right-hand side in that image on the left, you can see a little kind of white thing with a dome on the top of it, and that is solar radiation. But all the sites had the same exact measurements. They were just in different areas. So image B was in a forested area that hadn't been burned, and image C was in a burned area that had, I think that forest fire had gone through about 10 years prior. No, it was actually about 15 years prior to me getting there. So I'm not going to go over these too much in depth, but what I found in my PhD research was that, not surprisingly, but forest fire and burned forest greatly affected the snowpack, not just in the way that energy went into them, but also in the fact that the trees themselves contribute heat to the snowpack after they've been burned. So that left image shows the snowpack's vertical temperature, so from the ground up to the surface of it. And you can see that there's these bright purple and kind of bright yellow distinctions that are a little bit more pronounced on the bottom left or C of that left image. And that's because that was the fire, the burned area. And so in that area, any type of change to air temperature actually propagated downward into the snowpack a lot more because the snowpack was shallower. And you can see that on the left, the snowpack depth. So again, brighter colors are hotter, darker colors are cooler. So you can see, you know, that snowpack kind of averaged like 50 centimeters. So, you know, maybe 1.5 feet, a little bit under 2 feet. And you can see just how much air temperature affected it. Whereas the image above it showed that in the undisturbed forest, or the one that hadn't burned, that air temperature had a lot less of an effect because it was deeper and had more snow to go through. So that's that image. The image right next to it, or the one in the center, again, I'm not going to go into in depth, but it just basically shows that when a forest burns, it goes from actually cooling the snowpack around the tree trunks to warming the snowpack around the tree trunks. So in A, you can see a 24-hour period in an unburned forest, which shows this kind of dark purple that develops next to the tree trunk. And that's actually cool air sinking in the late morning and then kind of sitting there helping the snowpack stay cool. Whereas B, the one underneath it, you see this kind of bright yellow area develop next to the middle of this little center dot, and that's heat radiating outward from the tree trunk. So in these burned forests, the trees actually contribute to snow melt, which is not ideal, of course. And I think for our purposes, I'll probably ignore this image, but all I'll tell you is the bright red colors are melt within the snowpack, and you can see that the top one in the unburned forest has a lot more pinks and greens, which generally means normal snowpack evolution. And the one in the center is actually a burned forest. So you can see it goes immediately from green, which is new snow, to red, which is melt. And there's a lot less of these pinks, which are normal snowpack evolution. So a lot of impact is what I learned from my PhD. So after that, I actually wound up somewhere that is snowy here in the Sierra Nevada, and wound up working here at the CSSL with a whole lot of new collaborators. And these are the new collaborators that I've been working with. So we work a lot with the Department of Water Resources, the National Weather Service, the University of Nevada, Reno, because the government loves acronyms, the USDA and NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and then the Desert Research Institute. And I'll go into what we do with them a little bit more, but that's just kind of a broad overview. So the California Department of Water Resources is our largest collaborator right now. And we develop new instrumentation for them. And actually we teach all of their personnel, as Carol mentioned, how to do measurements on these 265 what we call manual snow courses. And so all of those measurements are developed, measurement techniques, I should say, are developed here. We test a lot of their infrastructure that they put out in the field. We test new sensors to see how well they work. And so we do an awful lot with them. On the bottom left, you can see what we call a neutron sensor. And this is a new piece of technology that might eventually replace, going out and sticking tubes into the snowpack like is tradition. But effectively, what it does is the sun, the universe emits neutron radiation, and water is one of the very few things that blocks it. So when you bury the sensor, generally at the top layer of the soil, and the snow builds up on top of it, you can see the difference as if when it wasn't there, I should say when it wasn't there, when the snow wasn't there versus when it is. And by comparing the two, you can figure out how much water is in the snow, which is awesome because of course, we really want to make sure we have enough water in our snow. So that image that's next to our bottom left one that says Snow Survey Procedure Manual, that was developed by the previous manager here, and is the manual that DWR uses to train all their personnel. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, we are embarking on brand new things here on the site and new infrastructure, which I'm very excited about. And so those kind of goofy looking tower schematics and that picture, we're installing a brand new tower here to mount a lot more instrumentation on to continue doing our research, and that will enable us to install larger instrumentation. So in the past, we haven't been able to put things like radar in, which helps us understand rain and snow and rain on snow. And with this new tower, we'll be able to do that. And so DWR has been very cool in helping us out with that. Take a deep breath for a minute. So as I mentioned, we are working with the NRCS. And so there's actually about 730 to 850, depending on how many are functioning and if we include Alaska. But there's these massive number of sites in the Western US states called snow-tell sites or snow telemetry. And we have 34 of them in California. Now, they're all comprised of this, what's in this image on the left. So we have a snow pillow that's kind of sitting here at the bottom of the site that measures the same thing that Neutron sensor does, the amount of water in our snow. And the best way that I found to explain how this thing works is imagine taking a Ziploc bag and filling it a quarter of the way full, and then taping a straw to it so that water can only escape into the straw. So when you push on top of it, water goes up into the straw, and that's how the snow pillow works, except it has a fluid between two sheets of metal that has a tube running out of it. And when pressure is put on that from the weight of the snow, it goes into a little sensor that measures how much force there is in it, and that gives you how much water is in the snow. I love talking about the snow pillow. It's kind of an interesting piece of technology. But at the rest of these sites, they also have solar radiation, wind measurements, air temperature. They do measure snow depth as well, and then relative humidity. And the cool thing is that the Central Sierra Snow Lab here is the only spot, the only one of these hundreds and hundreds of sites where it's actually located with a full-time staffed facility. So we can test all kinds of new instrumentation against these snow-tell sites, which are kind of considered the golden standard. So that's really, really cool. And then we do work with the Desert Research Institute. They've had their instrumentation here for about 2 decades. And this plot on the bottom, or on the right here, just shows some of the data that you guys have access to at any given time. If one, if you really get curious and you're like, I wonder what's going on up at the Snow Lab, and you want a very thorough analysis of it, you can go to the Desert Research Institute website, which I'll show to you guys a little bit later, and get all of this really cool data from it. But yeah, they've been up here for about 2 decades. We're trying to kind of save that partnership because they're limited on funding, we're limited on funding, but it would be great to have them continue here on site. So that's more or less what we've been doing to this point in time over the last several decades. We've had these partnerships with DRI, with DWR, and with with the snow-tell sites, the NRCS. But this is an area, these are areas that I really want to focus on going forward. Of course, fire, my background being very pertinent to California, we really want to understand fire's impacts on snow. And so that's an area that CSSL is going to continue into the future. So on the left-hand side there, you can see this image. This was actually back on the 3rd of September, so before the fires finished for the year. But you can see the Dixie Fire, to the northwest of Tahoe, of course, northeast of the Bay Area. And then you can see the Calder Fire just south of Tahoe too, these kind of little brown scar areas. And, one of the interesting things about the fires out here in California that mirrors how they are in Australia is that they burn just these absolutely massive areas. So the Dixie Fire actually ended up burning about 95%, I believe it was, of the catchment that it was in. And, catchment is just effectively an area where all the water from various slopes and areas come together into a river basin. And so, 95%, that's going to greatly affect how the water comes out of that area. And so that's why fire is a focus. But of course, with climate change continuing and warming of the atmosphere, we're starting to see more rain too. And rain, as we can see in that image in the bottom center, can be absolutely catastrophic when it's added to snow, because it can produce these flash flooding events. And of course, all that water that's sitting in the middle of downtown Reno is not going into a reservoir. So not only does it cause damage to these large areas in terms of infrastructure and insurance claims, but that's water that's not going to make it into our faucets and into our agriculture. And so there's a big push now with increasing rain to understand how rain falling on snow actually impacts the snow and causes melt. And so that's an area that we're going to focus on as well. And then finally, the instrumentation thing. The instrumentation has been a focus of CSSL, but we have such a wonderful site and not many that compare to it, that we're going to continue testing things moving forward. So any type of new instrumentation we can get our hands on, we are absolutely going to work on. Now, that picture on the right is what we call a SODAR, which emits a very loud beep, enough to give you tinnitus. I can tell you from firsthand. I don't think I've had it damage my hearing, but it is incredibly loud. And oddly enough, it echoes throughout various levels of the atmosphere, and it can tell you information about wind speeds and temperatures and even relative humidity. Luckily for our neighbors, we're not testing those there. I just like those here. I just like that picture. But as an example of new instrumentation we are testing, we're doing a project with the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I used to work, on something called the 3D printed automatic weather station, or a 3D pause, which is a 3D printed weather station that is low cost, that is particularly useful in developing countries, so they can monitor their weather and their water. So that project's been around for probably a little bit less than a decade, but we're testing a new snow depth sensor for them. And we've got 2 of those on site this winter. So I'm very excited about that project. And actually, they're getting ready to do an article on that sensor. So if you're interested in it, keep an eye on NCAR's social media pages, and you'll probably see a good article coming out soon on it. So to expand a little bit on what I was talking about with fire impacts on snow, this is actually some work that Ariel Koshkin and Ann Nolan at UNR are doing. And I saw a presentation of theirs and absolutely loved it. So I asked if I could steal it. But this is actually, let me see if I can move this little toolbar up here. There we go. So this is actually from the San Joaquin Watershed here in California. And of course, we ended up having a fire go through that area, the creek fire. And there were various other little fires that had occurred in the previous, 120 years in that area, but the creek fire was by far the largest. So you can see in that top left image, the outline of the San Joaquin Watershed. The kind of hatched or striped red area is where the creek fire burned. And then there's also various little shades of yellow and red that are from the previous fires. So one of the things that they did after this fire came through was they went through and flew over it with an airplane that has LiDAR, or an instrument that emits a laser and then kind of does measurements of the forest and various things when it bounces back. And so that's what you see on the top right, is these LiDAR measurements from the airplane that show the burn severity. So bright yellow is the worst burned areas. Purple is unburned, kind of those ambers, and kind of lighter purples are lesser burned areas. But that shows you just how intense a lot of the burn was, kind of in the south center of this area. And then on the bottom, you can see just how different each of these areas is. You can see the high burn area, which has all this black soot on the snow, and the snow is kind of wavy, and it's got all of this kind of undulation to it. And that's because the forest is actually speeding up the melt. All that black carbon, as we call it, is falling on the surface. That's absorbing more sunlight, warming the surface of the snowpack and causing a ton more melt. I see something in the chat. No worries, head out. Thank you for visiting. In the middle there, you have what we call a moderate fire area. So you can see the bottom of the trees have been burnt. You know, some of them are dying, but it hasn't gone through, you know, the tops of the trees for what we call a crown fire, like on the left in the high burn area. So this still has an impact, but less so. You still have a little bit of increased winds because some of the pine needle burned off, and those increased winds help with more evaporation, which of course we don't want because that removes water from where we have it to basically out east, because the wind's going to carry it out east. And of course that's at a maximum in the high burn area, but we still get a little bit of that in the moderate burn, but not nearly as much. And then of course on the right hand side we see our beautiful unburned forest, which really acts to help protect our snow. So I'm going to give you guys, I'm sad to say, another screen full of plots. This one I'm going to go into even less depth than the last one, but all I'm going to say is when you look at these plots here, the high burn areas all the way on the right, the non-burned areas all the way on the left, and we're just looking at, first of all, how much water is in the snow in each of the areas. So you can see in the non-burned area, there's a fair bit more. In the high burned area, there's a lot less. And these measurements, of course, happened over time. So in February, you know, everybody had some good snow, some good water in the snow. It wasn't that big of a deal. But come April, we had almost no water left in our snow in the high burn area versus, you know, even a moderate burn or no burn. And then of course, they were all gone by May last year. So it just goes to show how crazy the impact is from these types of fires on our snow and our water resources. And that's why in the New York Times article, I was trying to make the point that drought is no longer about just rain and snow. You have to take into account these other things like this large scale landscape change from forest fires, because now it's going to change how much water is in the snowpack, how fast that water is making it to streams, and then ultimately how much of it's making it to groundwater or our reservoirs. And so these are things that we really need to look at when we do consider drought and the severity of it. But that was one of the points that I made. And that's kind of the most pertinent thing that I can say probably out here in California right now, because we do have these massive fires that are occurring every year. It does not like my arrow keys. I don't know why. So we do have also, you know, atmospheric rivers. I think probably you guys are well aware of the impact of these because we had one in October that just drenched us in rain. And then of course we had more in December that, as I mentioned, gave us a record-breaking snowiest December of all time here at the lab with 214 inches of snow. So just over 17.5 feet in the course of about 18 days. So almost a foot a day, which was just insane, but really, really fun. And some of this, you know, these atmospheric rivers actually occur all around the world in various places, not just here. And this, these images kind of in the middle of this are from some research that I did with my advisor down in Australia, where they called them northwest cloud bands, which is why you can see that kind of said on the top right-hand image there, this northwest cloud band over the top of Australia. They really do call those northwest cloud bands, whereas the rest of us refer to them as atmospheric rivers, right? So these images just kind of show, first of all, you can see all of that beautiful moisture coming across the continent. And the area that we were concerned with is down here on the southeast side, kind of where my cursor is. That's where the snowy mountains are. And up here on the northwest side is, of course, where all this moisture comes from, which is why they're called northwest cloud bands. The top left image is just kind of the weather setup for the moment. I won't go too much into it other than to say these spiky little black lines are cold fronts. And oftentimes, as with us here in California, these atmospheric rivers are really amplified by cold fronts and low pressure systems. And so that's why we were interested in that. But you can see in this image on the bottom left, how much moisture is being brought across the country. And these darker pink shades or red shades are the areas with the most moisture. And so you can see there's a lot of it being brought down from the northwest, and then it's all kind of impacting the snowy mountains in the southeast. So this is very similar to what we see in our atmospheric rivers up here, because it can cause this, which is, believe it or not, a parking lot at a ski resort. And luckily, I don't think there are any cars under it, but there was, at the beginning of this event, about 3 to 4 feet of snow on the ground. And after only a day and a half, it had all melted from this very warm rain. And that's, again, why we're concerned about it here in California too, because we do get these events that flood Reno and that rapidly take what I like to refer to as the snowpack reservoir off of the mountains and whisk it downstream, either causing flooding or, in an absolutely lucky instance, actually taking it to our reservoirs. But this is increasing in the amount of times that it's happening, but also how intense it is. And so this is an area around the world that we're particularly interested in. And it's not just us here at the lab or with the Department of Water Resources. Scripps down south in California, Scripps Oceanography, they're doing a ton of research on this, including airplanes flying through it, almost like the hurricane hunters with their airplane and hurricanes. And there's just a large consortium of people working on these atmospheric rivers because they bring us a ton of moisture, which is amazing, but they can spell doom for our snowpack, which is, of course, not what we want. So that's kind of the long rundown of everything that we do here at the lab and the future things that we're going to be doing and continuing to explore. With us only being around and very, very public about our existence in the last year, I wanted to introduce you guys to some of these tools if you haven't seen them before. So one of my objectives is science communication. That's why I like to write pieces in the newspaper. Why I like to do interviews is because it's daunting to have to consider all this information. As a scientist, I can only imagine what it's like for the average person. It's probably like me trying to understand physics and string theory. Maybe not that complicated. But as far as our website goes, it is brand new, and I'll show this to you guys here. I will pop that up because I know that you're still stuck on the other page. So this is our new web page. It tells you all the new snowfall here at the Snow Lab over the last 24 hours, 48 hours, or even up to 7 days. We do have a little up-to-date graph that you can kind of drag and drop and examine. We have our state of the snowpack, which is so sad. 15% of where we would expect to see our peak, 19% of where we would expect to be at this time of year. And then we do have things like our precipitation to date. So this top one shows how much snowfall we've had, which is 95% of average, very promising. It's just melted too much early on. And then on the bottom, we have what's known as our average precipitation to date, which includes rain and snow. So this is one of the great pages if you guys want to check out things about the lab and our data. This is another page, and it always takes a little bit to load because it has to pull the data freshly. But of course, you guys aren't living up here in Soda Springs, so you'll probably be interested in what's going on throughout the Sierra Nevada, but it has these beautiful maps on it to talk about the most recent snowfall and the full season of snowfall. So we've had, looks like about 360 inches total of snowfall, which, hey, isn't half bad, better than last year for sure. So this is a wonderful page. You can look at various recent conditions like temperature and relative humidity, winds, things like that. You can also find all the data for our very long plot and zoom in. If you really remember a crazy period, in the 80s that you want to look at, you can zoom in and check out all the different years for that. And then if you are interested, you can download the plot to print, because some people like to do that, or even just access the data for the plot and kind of look at things yourself. Again, I want transparency. Science is about being transparent. We are technically a taxpayer-funded facility. So this is your data. My data is your data. So mi casa su casa. But we do have also this news page, which in all honesty needs to be updated. But this is where a lot of good articles and news is about the lab. And then we have a little about us, as most people do. And then if you are really interested in climate change and how we're measuring it here at the lab, you can click on this data tab, and it has a published data set. So this has been quality controlled, and you guys can pull this down and play with it yourself. Or there's also a bunch of useful links, on the left-hand side. So the information from the Desert Research Institute, the SNOTEL data here on site, or even just a website talking about the various little bits of the snow lab on Berkeley's website itself. So all kinds of different stuff that you can get into if you're so interested. All those links that I just talked about on the website are also here on the presentation. I'm not going to worry about clicking on them all because I'm kind of long-winded as it is, and I don't want to bore everyone to death. But the other thing too is, if you don't really care to visit the webpage every day to look at what's going on, we're always sharing cool things on Twitter. So we've got pics of the weather. Every time I do a measurement, if there's new snow, I try to upload a video. If there's particularly peaceful snow, given the world today and how chaotic it is, I always try to upload a moment of Zen for everybody to watch, because it can be quite relaxing. And honestly, kind of motivation killing to just stare out the window and stare at the snow for a little bit. But that's on Twitter. We also have a Facebook page that, we post everything to. And I really do, if you guys end up following us on our social media, or even through the website, reach out if you have questions. This is all, I want it to be as interactive as possible. And while it is only me and one part-time employee, we do have new graduate students engaging with us and new projects in development all the time. So we are constantly expanding our expertise and would love to answer questions that you guys have about the lab, or myself for that matter. So I think I'm about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, but that's kind of everything about the lab and myself. I'm going to turn it over to questions and discussion. And I hope you enjoyed me kind of taking you through a little bit of all things Snow Lab and myself all over the place, but I think it all was kind of pertinent. So.
I'll start with a question. When I had talked to you, it was shortly after the 1st of April, and that was the peak snow sort of expected because our rain season ends at the end of March generally. And it's proved true, because we've had this today and it was like mist here, very little rain, and we're expecting some more, but it won't be like this. It won't be a real rainfall. And if I remember correctly, you said that at that time we had like 38 or 39% of what was expected. And you alluded to today, and I heard on the radio this morning, that there's now something like 19%, which is an enormous drop. Mm-hmm. And that would be due to the very warm weather that we had the other day. That's very worrisome.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. We were at about 38%, and then we actually wound up with a few days where we were around 65 or even 70 degrees here on the summit, which, those are late June temperatures for us up here. And so, it has been rapidly coming off the hill. And we do have a little bit of bump up today. We got about 7.5 inches of snow, which will help.
Okay.
Not enough to get us, anywhere really good. There's whispers in the weather models that I've been following closely of another 2 to 4 feet on Saturday. But I don't know how much stock I'm going to put into that, because weather models are worthless more than a few days. I shouldn't say they're worthless. They're good, but this specific weather model has a bad tendency to exaggerate and make everyone hopeful and then make us all very sad. So it's Monday, and at this point, I consider the Saturday forecast wish casting, in my opinion. And so we're going to have to wait a couple more days to nail it down. It ended up being a good storm for us this weekend.
I noticed we are all from this group of the LBVBAE for Berkeley, Albany, are all in the EBMUD water zone.
Yep.
And it seems as though the last fire that went through there below, what was that one called? It wasn't the Creek Fire, but it was above, it was the Caldor Fire.
Yeah, the Caldor, yeah.
Didn't get into the drainage of our water. But that's not a guarantee that it won't at some point. So what kind of impact would we expect if that area were actually to burn seriously?
If it was a crown fire and it removed all the pine needles and the branches, similar to that high severity burn area, I think first of all, the impacts that you'll see is that there are going to be a lot more of these kind of weird pulses that the water managers are going to have to try to manage better. One of the issues I didn't go into this, but one of the issues with forest fires is that they can have really dramatic effects on the soil. And a lot of people don't think about the soil when they think about rain or snow, but with the forest fires, it can actually turn them hydrophobic or make the water shed off of it rather than soaking in. And so when it does melt, you get these quick pulses of water coming downhill out of those areas that can be kind of hard to manage if you're a water manager. But the other thing too is, if it is severe enough, the winds and the temperatures will really increase in that area, and you'll get more evaporation, which means less water in the end. I think, unfortunately, at this point, as with a lot of what CAL FIRE said, it's not a matter of if, but when all these areas burn. But this was one of the points that I was making in that article is, the current models that we have don't necessarily take those soil conditions into account and don't take these large land changes into account. And so it's really time to revisit that, because we don't want a repeat of last year where all of this water that we were expecting never came in. We have the technology and the science already at hand to improve those. A lot of what it comes down to is just getting the personnel in there to implement them and test them and make sure that they can be run efficiently.
Thank you.
Anybody should unmute themselves and ask any questions that they might have. Okay, I have another question. It was talking earlier in the week for a family member who works for a hydrology company, and he said that every year they generally empty out some of the dams so there won't be flooding, but that lowers the water level. Is that, what's the story on that? And is that, hopefully that won't be done this year because the level is so low, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, this starts to get a little bit more into the policy and management side of things, because there are, and I should, say that I'm not as well versed in those side of things, but there's certain stipulations that like DWR has to operate under, one of which being, of course, they have to provide water for endangered species to continue living, which is why a lot of people get angry. They go, oh, why should some fish live if we don't have water for X, Y, Z? But it's, that's a policy that's not as easy to just make a snap decision on. And the other thing too is, you're absolutely right. These dams are lowered in case of flood. And I can't think of an example here, but in 2011, there was massive flooding in Brisbane, Australia, which is in Queensland, which is where I lived. It was subtropical Queensland. I wasn't there when it happened, but just absolutely massive flooding. And one of the problems was that they had come off of what was known as the Millennium Drought, which existed basically from the early to mid 90s until basically 2011. Towns were running out of water, crops were completely dry. It was a very dire time for the entire country. And so when the rains came in, they said, great, stop all the water. And then they got too much, to the point where the dams began overflowing, and to prevent complete the structure from disintegrating, they had to do these massive releases that then literally flooded all of this Brisbane, which is a 3 million people city. So in that case, there were some inner politics going on, people not trusting rain forecasts and things like that. But there is a very fine line to be towed, because if we ended up, there were models in December suggesting that we were going to continue getting rain and snow in those large quantities through January. So if we weren't releasing from the reservoirs, we could have wound up in a really precarious spot. We don't want another Oroville level catastrophe, what could have been a catastrophe. But at the same time, during these drought years, you don't want to run out of water. So that's another reason why, I'm kind of like, we need to reevaluate the way we're doing things and try to improve our modeling, especially our long range modeling, because hopefully then we'll capture some of this unknown about the future. But it gets difficult because especially with weather models, we know the equations we have to use. The weather models are stellar. The problem is they take up too much computing power, and we can't forecast further into the future until quantum computing is here. So, but yeah, it's a fine line, keeping that storage in there for water usage and not wanting it to flood and destroy things.
So I grew up in California and lived in Sacramento during a period of time when both the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers had a tendency to flood. And I remember having to be carried by the bus driver over to the bus to get into the vehicle to be able to be driven to school. And there was one time over Christmas break when my father, who worked for the DWR, ended up having to patrol the levees where the people from mostly they were prisoners who were working on the levee there, were filling sandbags. So it's very clear. And this sort of thing also happens in Marin County. It's just not unusual. It's just that it's unpredictable, as you say.
And that's it. Everyone has these contingencies in place, but they tend to fight each other because it is so unpredictable. And the unfortunate reality of climate change is that it's just going to become more unpredictable. So how do you resolve a system becoming even even worse in its worst traits?
I have a question, and that is that's on the eastern side of the Sierra, and that's Reno. Seems like Reno, the population is growing and growing. But all the water comes from Lake Tahoe, doesn't it? Maybe that's not right. But I don't see how Reno can keep getting larger if the amount of water isn't going to be there. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's Reno, but also California in general. And yeah, you know, Reno does get a lot of their water from Tahoe for sure. I do think they have another smaller source. I can't remember what it is at this point. But one of the things that I have brought up recently in a few interviews is that, you know, there seems to be this arguing and finger pointing when it comes down to our drought and the limit of our water. A lot of people say, oh, agriculture uses 80%. And then some people say climate change isn't to blame. It's, you know, 40 million people when it used to be 5. And the reality of it is it's all of it. And the problem is the growing population has put, you know, I said this here, let me step back for a second. We have a really simplistic view as people overall with drought. You know, traditionally it is a period of less than average rain or snow, but there's this second part to the definition that says it has to cause a hydrological imbalance. Unfortunately, we as a species have created a substantial hydrological imbalance on the west side of the United States and in other regions as well because of the growing populations. You know, if this was a desert devoid of any human habitation, then you kind of just let things go as they are. But because the population has expanded, and of course we've influenced the climate, now we have this compounding issue where we can't get water from the Colorado River anymore. Reno can't get it from Tahoe as much. And so our water resources are never going to be as large as we need them to for our expanding population. And so then it becomes a question of, clearly this isn't going to work going forward. How do we solve it? Well, there's, you know, some people say pipelines from the Mississippi. Well, we can't get enough employees for our state-run agencies to update their models. How do you know, how are we going to invest billions upon billions in getting these pipelines built? And the same thing with desalination. Everybody goes, oh, it's so expensive. Well, what are the costs that you're going to pay once the water runs out? Once people have to leave their houses without being able to sell them because you don't have water coming out of your faucet. Nobody wants to buy a house that doesn't have water. Then you start talking potentially about migration eastward to where there is water. So it's one of those things where the population's expanding. The water that we do have isn't going to continue to sustain it. We have to invest in some of these other technologies. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but I hope it was at least something along the lines of what you were looking for.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
So was the flooding in Reno from Lake Tahoe, or was it from the mountains right around Reno?
A little bit of both. You know, the Truckee River takes a lot of the water that exists from all of the slopes around it and routes it right through the middle of Reno. But some of it did come out of Tahoe as well. So, and there's been, I think, 2 of those larger events. One, I want to say, was in '96, and the other was, I think, in the mid 2000s. I can't remember that one though. But yeah, it was kind of a consolidation of all the water coming from various places, but primarily from the Tahoe and Truckee area. Oh, and I should mention that one of those flooding events came on the heel of a record large snowfall event. It was a huge month, and then rain came in and fell on top of that brand new snow and melted it all, which caused just a massive cascade of water and mud flows down the Truckee River basin and into Reno.
Normally the river continues to flow up to Pyramid Lake, right?
Yeah.
But if it's too much of it to make the curve around, I guess, then it goes where it wants.
Yep. Jumps those banks and just decides to hang out where it wants to.
You mentioned Brisbane in Australia before in the flooding incident, but this recently they had flooding near Sydney in New South Wales. Was that the similar kind of cause or unrelated, different?
It was actually very, very similar, except it wasn't caused by a dam release this time. In fact, where we lived in Brisbane, which was heavily impacted by those floods in 2011, flooded again this last time, unfortunately. And they've been flooded. They were flooded in 1974. And it's unfortunately a big bowl where all this water sheds down, just kind of like Reno in a way. But yeah, there were lessons learned for sure from that 2011 event and water storage in those reservoirs. And as a result, this time, they were, I think, a little bit better prepared. And so in all reality, it's crazy to think about, but in only a day and a half, the reservoir storage went from 34% to, I think, 160. So, just an absolute crazy inundation where you're talking about tens of percents in a reservoir, the largest reservoir in basically a state the size of the entire southwestern US that filled itself in 36 hours. And so, if you had more storage in there, it could have been a lot worse. Maybe it was a good thing there was a few years of drought before all that water came in. But these types of La Nina years are when those events happen for Brisbane.
So don't we need to build more reservoirs all over for both drought years and store it for those type of situations, or not?
I don't have an easy answer for this one, to be honest, and I haven't looked that far into it. I think one of the biggest issues that I have is you can't capture what isn't there. And more often than not in California these days, we're in a drought year rather than a surplus year. We definitely have those surplus years on occasion. But I think the cost of infrastructure, the environmental cost of new dams is probably somewhat prohibitive to putting them in when we're only getting a big year, I should say, with water maybe once a decade at this point. But that's my opinion. That's anecdotal. I don't have any data to back that up.
It also makes it hard to do pump storage for power.
I think I caught some of that. What was the other part? Sorry, could you say that again?
I said it makes it difficult to have pump storage as a part of your power solution. So if you let the water go out of your dam into a lower dam, that helps you with not having flooding in the upper dam, and also the potential for being able to pump the water back up to use for electricity. But we also don't have necessarily the space and also the time takes to build those things.
Absolutely. And they call it the engineering marvel of Australia, but it's called the Snowy scheme. And it's exactly that. It's a system of massive dams, hydroelectric plants throughout all of the snowy mountains in Australia that do exactly that. They have upper storage and lower storage. Their pumping they have their pumping worked out to where they're generating electricity when it's most expensive and pumping it back up to the top when it's least expensive, so that they can make more money that way. But they definitely have a larger system of dams up there. But with that being said, they have their own whole set of issues. If you think our water models are bad, they're in a whole nother category.
I was at the Snowy Mountains once. It was maybe end of June, beginning of July, and it was their Christmas.
Christmas in July is a real thing in Australia. They put up little displays in the stores, and it's funny, Christmas in July, and I'm like, it is still 75 degrees outside. That is nonsense.
Well, all the ladies wore their fur coats to the parties in the Snowy Mountains.
Yeah, my second week in Brisbane, I should say my first week in Brisbane was the second week of June, and they were running this crazy news blitz because it was a cold snap and everyone was freezing and everyone was out in their, down jackets, and it was 55 degrees outside, and they had mittens on and knitted hats, and I'll never forget it. They panned over and the reporter ran over to this guy who was in like a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops. And they said, sir, aren't you cold? And he goes, I'm from Switzerland. This is nothing. I'm like, I grew up in Denver. I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right.
Does anyone else have any questions? Because if we don't, this might be a good time to end. Any last comments? I find this absolutely fascinating, and we thank you so much. I think I personally learned a lot, and the effect of fires on the trees and the soil and as part of this whole equation is something I really didn't think about before and won't be able to not think about in the future. So we thank you ever so much for the work you're doing and for taking the time to tell us all about it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Like I said, I love science communication, and I'm always happy to chat. And if you guys have any more questions, feel free to email me too.
And we'll post this on our YouTube channel, and it will get viewed more than by the people that were just here this evening. So we thank you and have fun up there in the snow.
I will. Fingers crossed for more rain and snow.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so
Cool.
much.
Thank you.
Maybe you can join
Thank
us
you.
again sometime.
What was that?
Maybe you can join us again sometime.
I would be happy to. And if you guys are ever up in the area, we do snow tours. You just have, or lab tours. You just have to reach out in advance. So let me know.
Sounds terrific. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
you.